When tech billionaire Isabella Sterling walked into Daniel Cooper's struggling auto repair shop in the quiet town of Riverside Falls with a $2 million marriage contract, she expected a desperate man to jump at her offer. What she didn't expect was for his response to leave her completely speechless and change both their lives forever. But to understand why Daniel's answer shocked the most powerful woman in Silicon Valley, we need to go back to where it all began. In the grease-stained garage, where dreams come to die and miracles sometimes happen. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights of Cooper's auto repair flickered with the same uncertainty that plagued Daniel Cooper's life every morning at 5:30 a.m. At 48, his calloused hands told the story of 2 decades spent rebuilding engines while his own world slowly fell apart. The wrench in his grip felt heavier these days, weighted not just with years of use, but with the crushing pressure of a man watching everything he'd built slip through his fingers like motor oil. Daniel pulled the chain that brought the overhead lights humming to life, casting harsh shadows across the cluttered workspace that had once been his father's pride and joy. The garage occupied a corner lot on Maple Street in Riverside Falls, a manufacturing town that had seen better decades. Where chrome bumpers once gleamed with prosperity, rust now ate away at the dreams of families who'd built their lives around steady paychecks from factories that had long since moved overseas. The stack of overdue notices on Daniel's desk told a story he didn't want to read. Electric company, $847 past due. Bank mortgage, 3 months behind. Insurance premium, canceled for non-payment. Each red-stamped envelope represented another piece of the life he'd tried to build for his 11-year-old daughter Emma, crumbling like the concrete foundation beneath his feet. Riverside Falls had been different when Daniel was growing up. The main street bustled with shops owned by families who'd lived there for generations. The auto plant employed half the town, and Friday nights at the high school football games brought the whole community together. Now, boarded storefronts outnumbered open businesses 3-to-1. And the only crowds gathering were at the unemployment office. Daniel's morning ritual never changed. Unlock the bay doors, start the coffee pot that had been brewing the same bitter fuel for 15 years, and count yesterday's meager receipts while planning how to stretch them across impossible demands. Today's count yielded $127, enough to cover maybe half the electric bill or a quarter of the mortgage payment, but not both. The bell above the front door chimed with the arrival of his first customer, Mrs. Patterson, whose 1998 Honda Civic had been limping along on prayers and discount brake pads for the past 6 months. She approached the counter with the careful steps of someone who'd learned to measure hope in small doses. "Morning, Daniel. I hate to ask, but could you take a look at that rattling sound again? I know I still owe you for the last repair, but I'm scared to drive Emma to her violin lessons tomorrow if that noise gets worse." Daniel forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Mrs. Patterson had been Emma's first violin teacher, volunteering her time when Daniel couldn't afford proper lessons. The elderly widow lived on Social Security and kindness, making her one of the few customers who understood that sometimes helping each other mattered more than balancing books. "Don't worry about the payment, Mrs. Patterson. Let me take a listen." As he knelt beside her car, Daniel's mind wandered to Emma, probably just waking up in their small apartment above the garage. At 11, she'd inherited her late mother's musical gift and her father's stubborn determination. Her violin playing filled their modest home with beauty that made the cracked walls and secondhand furniture fade into insignificance. But talent needed nurturing, and nurturing cost money Daniel simply didn't have. The violin lessons Emma received were charity disguised as friendship. Her instrument was borrowed from the school's depleted music program. The dress she'd worn to last month's recital had been altered 3 times to accommodate her growing frame, and Daniel had seen her quietly declining birthday party invitations because she was embarrassed about not being able to bring gifts. The rattling in Mrs. Patterson's car turned out to be a loose heat shield, a 15-minute fix that would have cost $200 at the dealership. Daniel tightened the bolts and waved away her attempts to discuss payment, knowing she needed her grocery money more than he needed to feel like a successful businessman. By noon, Daniel had serviced 2 more vehicles and earned enough to buy groceries for the week, assuming he could find a way to keep the electricity on long enough to cook them. He was reviewing a stack of bills when the phone rang with news that made his hands shake. "Mr. Cooper, this is Janet Morrison from Riverside Elementary. Emma's teacher wanted me to call about the district's advanced music program. Emma has been selected for the Regional Youth Orchestra, which is a tremendous honor. However, there are some costs involved. New instrument rental, competition fees, travel expenses for performances. The total would be around $3,000 for the year. Daniel's throat constricted as he processed numbers that might as well have been $3 million. Emma's musical gift was the one bright spot in their increasingly dark world, the one thing that proved something beautiful could grow from their humble circumstances. The thought of telling his daughter that her talent would go undeveloped because her father couldn't provide what she needed felt like swallowing broken glass. Could I call you back about the details?" Daniel managed, his voice barely steady. "Of course. But, Mr. Cooper, I hope you'll seriously consider this opportunity. Emma has exceptional talent. With proper training and exposure, she could earn scholarships that would change her entire future." After hanging up, Daniel sat in his office chair that squeaked with every movement and stared at the photograph on his desk. It showed him, Emma, and his late wife Sarah at last year's school concert, all three of them beaming as Emma held her violin. Sarah had died 2 years ago in a car accident, leaving Daniel to navigate single parenthood while grieving the loss of his best friend and business partner. Sarah had always been the optimistic one, the dreamer who saw possibilities where Daniel saw obstacles. She believed Emma's musical gifts were a sign of great things to come, worth any sacrifice necessary to nurture them properly. Now, faced with an opportunity that could launch Emma toward the future Sarah had envisioned, Daniel felt the crushing weight of inadequacy. The afternoon brought more of the same. Customers who couldn't afford full repairs, bills that couldn't be postponed much longer, and the growing certainty that he was failing at the most important job of his life, being Emma's father. As closing time approached, Daniel calculated and recalculated their finances, searching for mathematical miracles that simply didn't exist. At 6 p.m., he climbed the narrow stairs to their apartment, where Emma sat at the kitchen table with homework spread before her like a battle plan. Her violin case rested against the wall, scratched and worn, but containing the instrument that transported her to worlds beyond Riverside Falls, economic limitations. "How was school, sweetheart?" "Good. Mrs. Morrison said I might get to audition for something special, but she wants to talk to you first." Emma's eyes sparkled with the kind of excitement that made Daniel's chest ache with love and worry in equal measure. "We'll see what she has to say." As they shared a dinner of grilled cheese sandwiches and canned soup, Daniel watched his daughter's animated descriptions of her day and felt the familiar weight of impossible choices. Emma deserved every opportunity, every chance to develop her extraordinary gift, but providing those chances seemed as impossible as rebuilding an engine with broken tools. That night, after Emma had practiced violin for an hour and settled into bed with a library book, Daniel sat at his kitchen table with bills spread before him like tarot cards predicting a difficult future. The numbers never balanced, no matter how he arranged them. The Regional Youth Orchestra represented Emma's chance at a broader musical education, but the $3,000 cost might as well have been $3 million. Outside their apartment window, Riverside Falls settled into evening quiet, street lights illuminating empty sidewalks and the kinds of dreams that felt too expensive to pursue. Daniel Cooper, devoted father and failing businessman, had no idea that tomorrow would bring an offer so outrageous it would change everything he thought he knew about hope, sacrifice, and the lengths people would go to find connection in an increasingly isolated world. But tonight, surrounded by unpaid bills and impossible choices, he was simply a man trying to hold together a life that seemed determined to fall apart, measuring success not in dollars but in his daughter's laughter and the music that filled their modest home with something approaching magic. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The sleek black Tesla Model S pulled up to Cooper's Auto Repair at exactly 10:30 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, its pristine surface reflecting the gray October sky like a mirror from another world. Daniel looked up from the transmission he was rebuilding, grease-stained hands pausing mid-motion as he watched the vehicle's silent approach. In Riverside Falls, luxury cars were about as common as unicorns, and this particular machine probably cost more than most people's houses. The woman who emerged commanded attention without trying. Tall and elegant, she moved with the fluid confidence of someone who'd never questioned whether she belonged in any room she entered. Her charcoal business suit was perfectly tailored, speaking to resources that extended far beyond Riverside Falls, economic reality. Silver hair was styled in a sophisticated bob that framed sharp cheekbones and intelligent blue eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of their surroundings with methodical precision. Daniel wiped his hands on a shop rag, suddenly conscious of the oil stains on his coveralls and the 3-day stubble that marked him as a man too busy surviving to worry about appearances. The woman approached the service counter with measured steps, her heels clicking against the concrete floor like a countdown timer marking the arrival of something significant. "Good morning," she said, her voice carrying the cultured tones of boardrooms and private schools. "I'm looking for Daniel Cooper." "That's me," Daniel replied, noting the way she studied his face with an intensity that made him feel like a specimen under examination. "What can I do for you? Though I have to warn you that Tesla's a bit outside my usual wheelhouse. We mostly work on domestic vehicles around here." A smile ghosted across her features, there and gone so quickly Daniel wondered if he'd imagined it. "I'm not here about my car, Mr. Cooper. My name is Isabella Sterling, and I believe we have some history to discuss." Isabella Sterling. The name hit Daniel like a wrench to the chest, dragging up memories he'd buried under 25 years of ordinary life. Izzy Sterling, the quiet girl who'd sat beside him in advanced chemistry during their senior year at Riverside Falls High School. The brilliant daughter of the town's only attorney, who'd helped him understand molecular structures while he'd shared his lunch money when her father forgot to leave her meal allowance again. But that awkward teenager bore little resemblance to the composed businesswoman standing before him. Where teenage Izzy had hidden behind oversized sweaters and anxious energy, this woman radiated the kind of authority that came from commanding respect in rooms full of people accustomed to being the smartest in any conversation. "Izzy?" The nickname slipped out before Daniel could stop it, earning him a raised eyebrow and something that might have been amusement. "Most people call me Ms. Sterling these days," she replied, though her tone carried warmth beneath its professional veneer, "though I suppose old friends are entitled to certain privileges." Daniel's mind raced, trying to reconcile the girl he'd known with the woman before him. Izzy Sterling had been brilliant but fragile, academically gifted but socially isolated. Her father, Richard Sterling, had been Riverside Falls' most successful attorney, representing the auto plant during labor disputes and earning a reputation for putting profit over people. Izzy had seemed embarrassed by her family's wealth, often eating school lunch alone rather than joining the groups of popular students her father's status should have granted her access to. "I heard you'd gone to MIT," Daniel said, memories surfacing like air bubbles from the bottom of a lake. "Full scholarship for computer science, if I remember correctly." "Computer science and business," Isabella corrected. "Graduated summa cum laude, went on to Stanford for my MBA, then spent 10 years in Silicon Valley learning how technology could reshape entire industries." She paused, her gaze taking in the cluttered garage with its vintage equipment and handwritten service schedules. "I founded Sterling Technologies in 2015. We develop software solutions for manufacturing automation." Daniel nodded, though the terms sounded like a foreign language spoken by someone describing life on a distant planet. "That sounds successful." "Successful enough?" Isabella's expression shifted, revealing something more complex beneath her professional mask. "Sterling Technologies is valued at approximately $2.8 billion. We employ over 15,000 people across 6 countries. I've been featured on the cover of Forbes magazine 3 times. The numbers hung in the air between them like exhaust fumes from a badly tuned engine. Daniel tried to process the idea that the girl who'd once borrowed quarters for vending machine snacks had built an empire worth more money than most people could imagine. It felt surreal, like being told his high school chemistry partner had discovered a new planet. "Congratulations," he said finally, meaning it despite the growing bewilderment about why one of the world's most successful entrepreneurs was standing in his failing auto repair shop. "Your parents must have been proud." Something flickered across Isabella's features. Pain, perhaps, or regret. "My parents died in a plane crash in 2018. Private jet went down during a storm over the Rockies. They were flying to a business conference in Denver." "Jesus, Izzy. I'm sorry, I had no idea." "It's fine," she said quickly, though the catch in her voice suggested otherwise. "It was unexpected, but life rarely follows the schedules we set for it." An uncomfortable silence settled between them, filled by the ambient sounds of Riverside Falls gradually waking up around them. In the distance, a train whistle announced the arrival of a freight line, carrying goods to places with more economic opportunity than their forgotten manufacturing town could provide. "Can I ask what brings you back to Riverside Falls?" Daniel ventured. "I imagine you could have any garage in the world service your car." Isabella's smile returned, more genuine this time. "I'm not here for car service, Daniel. I'm here because of you." "Because of me?" "Because of a conversation we had 25 years ago in Mr. Peterson's chemistry lab. Do you remember?" Daniel searched his memory, trying to recall specific moments from a time when his biggest concerns had been passing calculus and working up the courage to ask Sarah Mitchell to prom. Chemistry lab with Izzy Sterling. Most of their interactions had been academic, focused on balancing equations and understanding atomic structures. "You'd lost your lab partner," Isabella continued, "when Tommy Martinez moved to Detroit with his family. Mr. Peterson paired us up for the semester project on catalytic reactions. I was terrified because I'd never had a lab partner before, and you were popular enough that I figured you'd resent being stuck with the weird girl who actually enjoyed homework." The memory crystallized slowly, like a photograph developing in solution. Izzy Sterling, with her careful handwriting and nervous energy, approaching each experiment with the kind of methodical precision that made her an ideal partner for someone like Daniel, who tended to rush through procedures without reading instructions thoroughly. "I remember you saved my grade in that class," Daniel said. "Your lab reports were works of art. Mine looked like grocery lists written by someone having a seizure." "But you did something else," Isabella said, her voice dropping to something more intimate despite the professional setting. "Something I've never forgotten." Daniel waited, curious about which moment from their shared past had stayed with her across decades of presumably more significant experiences. "It was the day before Thanksgiving break. I'd been having problems at home. My parents were fighting about money again, which seemed ridiculous since we had more than most families in town. I'd come to school upset, and during our lab session I started crying while we were measuring reaction rates." The memory came flooding back with startling clarity. Izzy Sterling, normally composed and academically focused, breaking down over their shared Bunsen burner while trying to explain why her parents' arguments felt more devastating than simple disagreements. Her controlled sobs, the careful way she'd wiped her eyes to avoid smearing her makeup, the vulnerability she'd shown him that felt precious and fragile. "You didn't ask a bunch of questions or try to fix anything," Isabella continued. "You just handed me your clean shop towel and said, 'Sometimes being smart means knowing when to let yourself feel things instead of trying to solve them.' Then you finished the experiment while I got myself together." Daniel remembered that moment differently than she apparently did. He'd felt helpless watching someone so brilliant struggle with emotions that couldn't be quantified or solved through logic. The shop towel had been his only offering, a small gesture that felt inadequate in the face of her pain. "I went home that day thinking about what you'd said," Isabella said, "about feeling things instead of solving them. It was the first time anyone had given me permission to be human rather than just a grade point average with legs." The weight of memory settled between them like dust on old equipment. Daniel found himself studying this successful woman and seeing glimpses of the lonely teenager who'd been brilliant enough to earn scholarships but too isolated to feel truly connected to her community. "That's a nice memory," Daniel said carefully, "but I still don't understand why you're here, after 25 years, I mean." Isabella's expression shifted again, revealing something that looked almost like nervousness beneath her professional composure. "Because I've spent the last 2 decades building a fortune that can buy almost anything, Daniel, except the one thing I really need. Which is someone who remembers the person I was before the money changed everything. Someone who saw me as human when I felt like nothing more than a collection of expectations and achievements." She reached into her purse and withdrew a thick manila envelope, setting it on the service counter between them with the gravity of someone placing a bet on a high-stakes poker game. "I have a proposition for you, Daniel Cooper, one that might sound crazy, but could change both our lives in ways neither of us expects." Daniel stared at the envelope, noting its expensive weight and the way Isabella's hands trembled almost imperceptibly as she released it. Whatever was inside that envelope, he sensed it represented more than a simple business proposal. What kind of proposition? Isabella Sterling, tech billionaire and former chemistry lab partner, straightened her shoulders and met his eyes with the directness that had probably terrified boardrooms full of seasoned executives. "The kind that requires you to trust me the way I once trusted you with that shop towel. The kind that might save us both from the loneliness we've been carrying longer than either of us wants to admit." The envelope sat on the counter between them like a bridge spanning 25 years of separate lives, waiting for Daniel Cooper to decide whether some connections were strong enough to survive the weight of unexpected second chances. Home. The manila envelope felt heavier than it should have as Daniel picked it up, his calloused fingers noting the expensive paper stock and embossed letterhead that read, "Sterling Technologies Legal Division." Whatever lay inside had been prepared with the kind of attention to detail that suggested serious money and even more serious intentions. "Before you open that," Isabella said, her voice carrying a tremor that hadn't been there moments before, "I need you to understand that what I'm about to propose will sound insane. It will challenge everything you think you know about normal human relationships, and it will probably make you question my sanity." Daniel set the envelope back on the counter, studying Isabella's face for clues about what could possibly warrant such a dramatic preamble. In the fluorescent lighting of his garage, she looked younger somehow, less like the polished businesswoman who'd commanded boardrooms, and more like the nervous teenager who'd once cried over chemistry experiments. "I'm listening." Isabella took a deep breath that seemed to steady her resolve. "I want to offer you $2 million, Daniel. Cash, transferred to accounts of your choosing, with no strings attached and no repayment expected under any circumstances." The number hit Daniel like a sledgehammer to the chest. $2 million. More money than he'd earn in 10 lifetimes of fixing transmissions and replacing brake pads. Enough to secure Emma's musical education through college and beyond. Enough to rebuild his business, renovate the garage, maybe even expand into the empty lot next door. "What's the catch?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I want you to marry me." The words hung in the air between them like toxic fumes from a badly vented exhaust system. Daniel stared at Isabella, certain he'd misheard or misunderstood something fundamental about their conversation. "I'm sorry, what?" "A marriage contract," Isabella continued, her words coming faster now as if speed might make the proposal sound less outrageous. 1 year, legally binding, with specific terms and conditions that protect both of us. You would receive the $2 million upon signing the marriage certificate, regardless of what happens afterward. Daniel's mind reeled, trying to process the impossibility of what he was hearing. "You want to buy a husband?" "I want to hire a partner," Isabella corrected, though the distinction felt semantic at best. "Someone to appear at public functions. Someone whose presence provides the appearance of family stability. Someone who understands that this is a business arrangement rather than a romantic relationship." The garage suddenly felt too small, the walls pressing in around them as Daniel struggled to comprehend the magnitude of what Isabella was suggesting. Marriage, the sacred bond he'd shared with Sarah, the foundation of the family they'd built together, the commitment that had sustained them through Emma's birth and Sarah's death, reduced to a contractual obligation worth $2 million. "This is insane," Daniel said, backing away from the counter as if the envelope might explode. "People don't just buy marriages like they're purchasing office equipment." "Don't they?" Isabella's voice hardened slightly, revealing the steel that had probably served her well in Silicon Valley boardrooms. "How many marriages survive primarily because of financial security? How many couples stay together because divorce would destroy them economically? I'm simply being honest about the terms." Daniel shook his head, trying to clear the fog of disbelief that was clouding his judgment. "Why me, Isabella? You're a billionaire. You could have anyone you want. Why would you offer this kind of money to a broke mechanic from your high school?" For the first time since entering his garage, Isabella's composure cracked entirely. Her shoulders sagged slightly, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of loneliness that no amount of money could ameliorate. "Because you're the only person I know who remembers me before I became successful. Because you showed me kindness when I needed it most, without expecting anything in return. Because in a world full of people who want something from me, you're the only one who ever gave me something I actually needed." She paused, gathering herself before continuing with the vulnerability of someone confessing their deepest fears. "I'm 33 years old, Daniel. I've built a business empire, accumulated more wealth than most small countries, and earned respect from every major figure in the technology industry. but I go home every night to an empty penthouse apartment and eat dinner alone while watching the news. I attend charity galas where hundreds of people know my net worth but nobody knows my middle name. The admission hit Daniel harder than the money offer had. Despite all her success, despite the luxury car and designer clothes and corporate achievements, Isabella Sterling was essentially the same lonely girl who'd cried in chemistry lab 25 years ago. What about dating, relationships? Surely someone with your success has attracted exactly the kind of attention you'd expect, Isabella finished bitterly. Men who see dollar signs instead of a person. Men who want to be supported by my wealth or connected to my business network. Men who propose after 3 dates because they've done the math on my quarterly earnings reports. Daniel found himself thinking about his own dating experiences since Sarah's death, the well-meaning setups from concerned friends, the awkward dinners with women who seemed to be interviewing him for the position of stepfather rather than getting to know him as a person. The complexity of finding genuine connection when circumstances made every interaction feel loaded with ulterior motives. But marriage, Isabella, legal contract between people who barely know each other anymore? Separate bedrooms, she said quickly, pulling a folder from her purse and setting it beside the envelope. Separate living spaces within the same house. No intimate expectations, no romantic obligations. Public appearances when necessary for business or social functions, but private lives that remain completely independent. Daniel picked up the folder, finding it filled with photographs of a sprawling estate that looked like something from a magazine spread. Rolling lawns, a circular driveway, enough bedrooms to house a small army, and what appeared to be a separate guest house that could comfortably accommodate a family of 4. The Riverside Heights estate, Isabella explained. I purchased it last month. It's been empty for 3 years since the previous owner relocated to Florida. 23 acres, main house plus guest house, completely renovated with modern amenities while maintaining the original architecture. You bought a house here? In Riverside Falls? I bought it for us, Isabella said, her voice dropping to something more intimate. The guest house would be yours and Emma's. Complete privacy, your own entrance, your own space. The main house would be mine, though we'd share common areas when circumstances required. Daniel stared at the photographs, trying to process the idea of Emma growing up on an estate that probably cost more than most people's lifetime earnings. His daughter, who currently shared a converted bedroom above a failing auto shop living in a space that looked like it belonged to royalty. What about Emma? How do you expect an 11-year-old to understand that daddy's new wife is actually just a business partner? Children are more adaptable than adults give them credit for, Isabella replied. Emma would have access to the best educational opportunities, private tutors, advanced music instruction, preparation for college that most families can only dream about. The regional youth orchestra you mentioned, that would become the least of her opportunities. The mention of Emma's musical future hit Daniel like a physical blow. The $3,000 that had seemed impossible yesterday suddenly appeared trivial compared to the comprehensive support Isabella was describing. Emma could have the best instruments, the finest teachers, opportunities to perform and compete at levels that could genuinely launch a professional career. You investigated us, Daniel said suddenly, pieces clicking together in his mind. You know about Emma's musical talent, about our financial problems, about the orchestra opportunity. This isn't a coincidence, is it? Isabella's silence confirmed his suspicions more effectively than any denial could have. How long have you been watching us, Isabella? Since my parents died, she admitted quietly. Since I inherited their estate and started thinking about what really mattered in life. I hired a private investigator to locate people from my past, people who might remember me as something other than a corporate success story. The revelation felt like a violation, the knowledge that his struggles had been documented and analyzed by strangers. You had us investigated like we were potential business acquisitions. I had you researched because I remembered that shop towel, Isabella said fiercely. Because I remembered kindness offered without expectation of return. Because I wanted to know if the man who showed compassion to a crying teenager had grown into someone worthy of the trust I was considering placing in him. Daniel set down the photographs, his hands shaking slightly as the magnitude of the situation continued to expand. And what did your investigation tell you? That you're a devoted father facing impossible circumstances. That you work 80-hour weeks, trying to provide for a daughter whose talents deserve better opportunities than you can currently afford. that you've never remarried because you've been too focused on survival to consider your own happiness. The accuracy of her assessment stung, partly because it highlighted how predictable his life had become, and partly because it revealed how thoroughly she'd studied his personal circumstances. "And do you think the solution is a fake marriage?" "I think the solution is a partnership that benefits both of us," Isabella corrected. "You get financial security and opportunities for Emma that will last her entire lifetime. I get companionship and the appearance of family stability during a time when I need both." "What aren't you telling me?" Daniel asked, sensing undercurrents in her proposal that went deeper than loneliness or business considerations. Isabella hesitated, her composure wavering again as she seemed to weigh how much truth their conversation could handle. "There's something else," she said finally. "Something that makes this arrangement more urgent than I initially indicated. But I need to know you're seriously considering my proposal before I share information that changes everything about the timeline we're discussing." The envelope on the counter seemed to pulse with possibility and threat in equal measure. $2 million, a year of marriage to a woman he barely knew, and secrets that Isabella wasn't ready to reveal. Daniel thought about Emma practicing violin in their cramped apartment, about the bills stacked on his desk, about the youth orchestra opportunity that could change his daughter's entire future. "How long do I have to decide?" 72 hours, Isabella replied. "After that, I'll need to pursue alternative arrangements." 72 hours to choose between pride and practicality, between the independence he'd fought to maintain and the security Emma deserved. 72 hours to decide whether a marriage contract could ever become something genuine, or whether accepting Isabella's offer would compromise everything he believed about love, commitment, and the kind of man he wanted to be. As Isabella Sterling prepared to leave his garage, taking her impossible proposal and life-changing envelope with her, Daniel Cooper faced the most important decision of his life, one that would either save his family or destroy everything he thought he knew about himself. The sleepless hours that followed Isabella's departure felt like being trapped in a slow-motion car accident. Daniel could see the impact coming but felt powerless to change course. He'd sent Emma to stay with Mrs. Patterson for the evening, claiming he needed to work late on a complex repair, when the truth was he couldn't trust himself to maintain normal conversation while processing the most outrageous proposition of his life. Now, at 2:47 a.m., Daniel sat at his kitchen table with Isabella's manila envelope unopened before him, as if the formal contract inside might make her offer more real than his memory could handle. The coffee in his mug had gone cold hours ago, but he continued to grip it like an anchor to sanity in a world that had suddenly stopped making sense. $2 million. The number seemed to pulse in the air around him, transforming everything he looked at into monetary calculations. The cracked linoleum beneath his feet, $3,000 to replace. The refrigerator that hummed with mechanical distress, $800 for a decent used model. Emma's future, priceless, but apparently priced at exactly the amount Isabella Sterling was offering. Daniel's phone buzzed with a text from his brother Mike in Chicago. "Emma told me about some orchestra thing when I called her yesterday. Proud of that kid. You doing okay with the costs?" The message felt like salt in an open wound. Mike meant well, but his successful contracting business made it easy to offer emotional support while avoiding the financial realities Daniel faced daily. The investigation folder Isabella had left behind lay open beside the contract, revealing a depth of knowledge about his life that felt simultaneously invasive and oddly comforting. Someone had cared enough to document his struggles, to understand the weight he carried daily. The photos showed him and Emma at the grocery store, carefully comparing prices before making selections. Emma walking to violin lessons with her case slung over her shoulder, looking small and determined. Daniel locking up the shop each evening, his shoulders bent with exhaustion that went deeper than physical fatigue. But it was the final section of the investigator's report that had stolen his breath entirely. A medical evaluation based on observation and public records, noting signs of chronic stress, inadequate nutrition, and what the investigator clinically described as adaptive depression consistent with prolonged financial hardship and single-parent responsibilities. The phrase adaptive depression hit him like a diagnosis he'd been avoiding. Daniel had convinced himself that his constant exhaustion was normal, that the weight in his chest was simply the burden every responsible parent carried. Seeing his condition documented in clinical language forced him to confront how thoroughly survival mode had consumed his life. His phone rang, startling him from his brooding. The caller ID showed, Sterling, I. Daniel stared at the glowing screen, wondering what could be important enough for a billionaire to call a mechanic at nearly 3 a.m. Hello? Daniel, I'm sorry to call so late. I couldn't sleep, and I realized I left something important unsaid during our conversation today. Isabella's voice carried none of the corporate confidence she'd displayed in his garage. She sounded tired, vulnerable, and unexpectedly human. I'm awake anyway, Daniel replied, which was an understatement that bordered on comedy. There's something you need to know about why this arrangement is urgent for me. Something that makes the timeline non-negotiable and the partnership more critical than I initially indicated. Daniel set down his coffee mug, sensing that whatever Isabella was about to reveal would fundamentally change his understanding of her proposal. I'm listening. 6 months ago, I was diagnosed with a rare neurological condition called early-onset Huntington's disease. It's genetic, progressive, and ultimately fatal. The timeline varies, but most patients have 5 to 10 years before the symptoms become unmanageable. The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. Huntington's disease. He'd heard of it vaguely, something that destroyed motor control and cognitive function gradually, robbing people of their dignity piece by piece. The image of Isabella Sterling, composed and successful, facing such a future made his chest tighten with unexpected empathy. Jesus, Isabella, I'm so sorry. Currently, the symptoms are minimal, she continued, her voice maintaining clinical detachment that probably helped her discuss the undiscussable. Slight tremors in my hands during stressful situations, occasional balance issues, some difficulty with fine motor coordination. Nothing that significantly impacts my daily functioning yet. Yet, she agreed, but the progression is inevitable. Within 2 years, I'll likely need assistance with complex tasks. Within 5 years, I'll require full-time care. The disease will eventually take everything. My independence, my cognitive abilities, my capacity to manage the business I've spent my life building. Daniel found himself thinking about Emma, about the possibility of facing a terminal diagnosis while trying to protect his daughter from the full weight of that reality. The courage required to plan for such a future, to make arrangements while still capable of rational decision-making, seemed almost superhuman. Where does marriage fit into this? Legal protections, Isabella replied immediately. Healthcare decisions, business continuity, estate management. Without a spouse, those responsibilities fall to distant relatives who see me as a source of inheritance, rather than a person deserving of dignity during decline. The practical implications of her situation began crystallizing in Daniel's mind. Isabella wasn't just buying companionship. She was purchasing someone legally obligated to advocate for her interests when she could no longer advocate for herself. You want a medical proxy, someone who'll make decisions based on your wishes rather than their financial interests. I want someone who knew me before the money, who might remember the person I was when making decisions about the person I'm becoming, Isabella said, her voice dropping to something more intimate. Someone who showed kindness to a crying teenager might show similar compassion to a dying woman. The weight of what she was asking settled over Daniel like a heavy blanket. She wasn't just offering him money, she was asking him to witness her decline, to make impossible decisions about her care, to carry the burden of her final years with the dignity she deserved. What about your business, Sterling Technologies? Succession planning is already in motion. My CFO and CTO will assume operational control when I'm no longer capable. The company will continue, but I need personal arrangements that extend beyond corporate structures. Daniel walked to his kitchen window, looking out at Riverside Falls, sleeping streets while processing the complexity of Isabella's situation. In the distance, the old auto plant stood dark and empty, a monument to economic realities that made personal struggles feel simultaneously significant and insignificant. The $2 million, he said finally. It's not payment for a year of marriage, it's compensation for becoming responsible for your death. It's compensation for giving me the dignity of dying as someone's wife rather than as a corporate asset to be managed by strangers. Isabella corrected, though her voice carried acknowledgement of his assessment's accuracy. What happens to Emma in all this? How do I explain to an 11-year-old that her stepmother is dying? The same way you explained that her mother died in a car accident, Isabella replied gently. with age-appropriate honesty that prepares her for reality without overwhelming her with details she's not ready to process. Daniel thought about those terrible weeks after Sarah's death when he'd struggled to help Emma understand why the most important person in their world was suddenly gone forever. The conversations about heaven and memory, about love persisting beyond physical presence, about the difference between dying and being forgotten. You're asking me to help her grieve twice. I'm asking you to help her understand that love doesn't require permanence to be meaningful, Isabella said. That some relationships are precious specifically because they're temporary, and that choosing to care for someone despite knowing you'll lose them is one of the most courageous things humans can do. The philosophy felt both profound and heartbreaking. Daniel found himself thinking about his relationship with Sarah, how the knowledge that their time together was finite had made every ordinary moment feel precious in retrospect. The estate you showed me, the guest house arrangement, you planned all of this knowing you'd be dying there. I planned all of this hoping I'd be dying with dignity, surrounded by people who cared about me as a person rather than as a revenue source, Isabella replied. The guest house ensures Emma's stability regardless of what happens with my health. The main house provides space for whatever medical equipment or care assistance I might eventually require. Daniel closed his eyes, trying to imagine the progression Isabella had described. The successful businesswoman gradually losing control of her motor functions, her speech, her cognitive abilities. The daily reality of watching someone decline while maintaining hope and dignity throughout the process. How long before the symptoms become obvious? 12 to 18 months before I'll need to step back from active business management. 2 to 3 years before I'll require assistance with daily living activities. The timeline isn't precise, but the destination is certain. The honesty was both brutal and refreshing. Daniel had grown tired of people offering false hope, or avoiding difficult conversations about mortality. Isabella's directness felt like respect for his intelligence and emotional resilience. Why not hire professional care? With your resources, you could afford the best medical support available. Professional care provides medical expertise, Isabella said. It doesn't provide the emotional connection that makes suffering bearable. It doesn't ensure that decisions are made based on love rather than liability concerns. Daniel understood. He'd watched Sarah navigate her final weeks, surrounded by competent medical professionals who treated her symptoms while he tended to her spirit. The difference between clinical care and compassionate care had been the difference between dying comfortably and dying peacefully. I need time to think about this. Of course. But Daniel, I want you to understand something important. This arrangement benefits you far more than it costs you. Emma's future would be completely secured. Your financial struggles would end permanently, and the responsibilities you're concerned about wouldn't begin immediately. When would they begin? When I can no longer live independently, which means you'd have at least a year, possibly 2, of a relatively normal marriage arrangement before the caregiving obligations became significant. Daniel found himself calculating timelines, imagining Emma at 13 or 14, old enough to understand complex family dynamics but still young enough to benefit from the stability Isabella's resources could provide. The 72 hours you mentioned, is that negotiable? Unfortunately, no. I have other potential arrangements to consider if this partnership doesn't work out. But Daniel, Isabella's voice softened, I hope you'll seriously consider what I'm offering. Not just the money, but the opportunity to build something meaningful from unexpected circumstances. After ending the call, Daniel sat in his kitchen until dawn, watching the sun rise over Riverside Falls while contemplating the most important decision of his life. Isabella Sterling wasn't just offering him money, she was offering him the chance to matter in someone's final chapter, to provide dignity and compassion during humanity's most vulnerable transition. The question wasn't whether he could afford to accept her proposal. The question was whether he could afford to refuse it. The morning after Isabella's late-night revelation brought Daniel no closer to clarity, only a deeper understanding of the impossible weight his decision carried. He stood in his garage at 6 a.m., mechanically organizing tools while his mind churned through the implications of what she'd shared. Huntington's disease. The words echoed in his head like a diagnosis pronounced in a foreign language, clinical and devastating in equal measure. Emma arrived downstairs at her usual time, chattering about a math test while she gathered her violin case and backpack. Daniel watched his daughter's easy confidence, the way she moved through their cramped apartment with the assumption that tomorrow would bring the same modest security as today. How could he explain that their entire future hung in the balance of a decision that felt like choosing between salvation and moral compromise? "Dad, you look terrible," Emma observed with the brutal honesty only children could deliver. "Did you sleep at all?" "Just thinking about some business decisions," Daniel replied, which was technically true even if it failed to capture the magnitude of what he was considering. "Nothing for you to worry about." But Emma had inherited her mother's intuition along with her musical gifts. She studied Daniel's face with the same concentration she brought to difficult violin passages, seeing through his casual deflection to the anxiety beneath. "Is it about money again? Because I could ask Mrs. Patterson if she needs help with yard work or something. I'm old enough to earn money now." The offer broke Daniel's heart and steeled his resolve simultaneously. His 11-year-old daughter was already strategizing ways to contribute to their household income, accepting financial struggle as her normal, rather than recognizing it as a problem adults should solve. The youth orchestra opportunity that had seemed impossible yesterday represented just the beginning of a lifetime of limitations Emma would face if he couldn't find a way to change their circumstances. After Emma left for school, Daniel found himself driving through Riverside Falls, quiet streets, past the boarded storefronts and for lease signs that marked their community's economic decline. The auto plant that had once employed half the town stood empty, its parking lot cracked and overgrown with weeds that sprouted through decades-old asphalt. This was the world Emma was inheriting, a place where dreams went to die slowly, where talent was recognized but rarely nurtured, where good people made do with less while hoping for better. His phone rang as he parked outside the elementary school where Sarah had once worked. The caller ID showed his friend, Tom Martinez, who'd moved to Detroit years ago chasing better opportunities in the automotive industry. "Danny, man, I've been thinking about our conversation last week, about Emma's music thing and the costs involved. Listen, I know things have been tight since Sarah passed, and I've got some money saved up. Not a fortune, but enough to help with whatever she needs for this orchestra program." The offer was genuine and heartfelt, coming from someone who understood struggle firsthand. Tom had grown up in Riverside Falls, watching his own father lose job after job as manufacturing moved overseas. His success in Detroit represented everything that was possible for people willing to leave their roots behind in pursuit of economic survival. "I appreciate that, Tom, more than you know. But it's not just about the immediate costs. It's about everything that comes after. The competitions, the summer programs, the instruments she'll outgrow, the college preparation. We're talking about years of expenses I can't predict or plan for. So you move somewhere with better opportunities. Bring Emma to Detroit or Chicago, or anywhere that isn't dying a slow death like Riverside Falls. I could help you get established, maybe find work in one of the bigger shops." The suggestion made practical sense, but Daniel found himself resistant to the idea of abandoning the community that had shaped him. Riverside Falls might be struggling, but it was also the place where Sarah was buried, where Emma had spent her entire life, where neighbors still looked out for each other despite their own hardships. "It's not that simple, Tom." "It's exactly that simple, Danny. You're too stubborn to admit that loyalty to a dying town is costing your daughter her future. Sometimes the best thing a parent can do is recognize when they need to cut their losses and start fresh somewhere else." After ending the call, Daniel sat in his truck outside Sarah's old workplace, thinking about the choices that had brought him to this moment. He'd chosen to stay in Riverside Falls after high school, choosing familiarity over opportunity. He'd chosen to take over his father's garage rather than pursuing the engineering degree his grades could have supported. He'd chosen stability over ambition, community over advancement, and now those choices were limiting Emma's possibilities in ways that felt increasingly unfair. The afternoon brought a visit from Mrs. Henderson, the elderly neighbor who'd become Emma's unofficial grandmother since Sarah's death. She appeared in Daniel's garage with a casserole dish and the determined expression of someone prepared to meddle in other people's business for their own good. "Daniel Cooper, I've been watching you pace around this garage like a caged animal for 2 days. Either you tell me what's eating at you, or I'm calling Emma's teacher to find out what's really going on with this orchestra situation." Mrs. Henderson had been Sarah's closest friend, serving as Emma's emergency contact and providing the kind of grandmotherly wisdom that helped bridge the gap between Daniel's practical parenting and his daughter's emotional needs. Her threat to investigate independently wasn't idle. She had the community connections to uncover whatever was troubling him through alternative channels. It's complicated, Mrs. H. Complicated is my specialty. I raised 4 children through 2 factory closures, and a husband who thought poker was a viable retirement plan. Try me. Daniel found himself sharing an edited version of Isabella's proposal, describing it as a business opportunity that would provide financial security in exchange for some personal sacrifices. Mrs. Henderson listened without interruption, her sharp eyes noting the details he left unsaid. "This business opportunity," she said when he finished, "it wouldn't happen to involve that fancy car I saw parked outside your shop yesterday, would it? The one belonging to the Sterling girl who used to come back for summers when we were all younger?" The observation reminded Daniel that privacy was a luxury small towns couldn't afford. Mrs. Henderson's network of friends and neighbors probably knew about Isabella's visit before Daniel had finished processing her proposal himself. "How did you?" Martha Peterson saw her at the coffee shop this morning, looking like she hadn't slept any better than you have. Said she seemed nervous about something important, kept checking her phone like she was waiting for an answer to a question that mattered more than money. The detail about Isabella's apparent anxiety surprised Daniel. He'd been so focused on his own moral calculations that he hadn't considered how difficult the waiting period might be for her. A woman facing terminal illness, reaching out to someone from her past with a proposal that represented her best hope for dignity during decline. The vulnerability of her position suddenly seemed as acute as his own. "Mrs. H, if you were facing an impossible choice between pride and practicality, between maintaining your independence and accepting help that felt like selling your soul, what would you do?" "I'd ask myself who benefits from my pride and who suffers from my stubbornness," she replied immediately. "Then I'd remember that parenting means making hard choices, so your children don't have to." That evening, Daniel called his brother Mike in Chicago, hoping for perspective from someone who'd successfully navigated economic challenges without sacrificing family stability. Mike had built a successful contracting business, owned a house in a good neighborhood, and sent his own children to private schools that provided opportunities Riverside Falls couldn't match. $2 million? Mike's voice carried disbelief and something that sounded like envy. "Danny, people work their entire lives and never see that kind of money. What's the catch?" Daniel explained the marriage arrangement and Isabella's medical situation, watching his brother's excitement transform into concern as the full implications became clear. "You'd essentially be agreeing to become a widower again," Mike said quietly. "That's not just a business transaction, Danny. That's signing up for grief you can anticipate and plan for but can't avoid. But Emma's future would be secured. Completely. Not just the orchestra thing, but college, graduate school if she wants it, opportunities I could never provide on a mechanic's salary. And what about your future? You're 48 years old, not dead. Don't you deserve the chance to find love again, to build something lasting with someone who isn't dying?" The question hit harder than Daniel expected. Since Sarah's death, he'd focused so completely on survival and Emma's needs that he'd barely considered his own emotional future. The idea of remarrying for love had seemed like a luxury he couldn't afford, a romantic notion incompatible with the practical demands of single parenthood and financial struggle. "I don't know if I'm capable of that kind of love anymore," Daniel admitted. "Sarah and I had something special, but that was a different time in my life. Now I'm just trying to be the father Emma deserves." Maybe being the father Emma deserves includes showing her that adults can make choices based on hope rather than just necessity, Mike suggested. Maybe it includes demonstrating that love and commitment can take different forms but still be meaningful. As the 72-hour deadline approached, Daniel found himself standing in Emma's room, watching her sleep with the peaceful expression of someone whose biggest worry was remembering homework assignments. Her violin case rested against the wall, containing the instrument that represented both her extraordinary gift and the financial burden he couldn't adequately support. Tomorrow he would need to give Isabella Sterling his answer. Tomorrow he would choose between the independence that had defined his adult life and the security that could transform Emma's entire future. Tomorrow he would decide whether a marriage contract could become something genuine, or whether accepting help meant compromising everything he believed about love, commitment, and the kind of man he wanted to be. But tonight, surrounded by the modest apartment that represented both his limitations and his love for his daughter, Daniel Cooper prepared to make the most important decision of his life, one that would either save his family or force him to redefine everything he thought he knew about sacrifice, dignity, and the lengths a parent would go to secure their child's dreams. The clock on Emma's nightstand showed 11:47 p.m. In 12 hours and 13 minutes, his answer would determine whether Isabella Sterling's outrageous proposal became the foundation for an impossible family or remained just another reminder that some offers were too good to be true. The call came at exactly 11:59 a.m., 1 minute before Isabella's 72-hour deadline expired. Daniel stood behind the counter of his garage, the signed marriage contract in his trembling hands, watching the number he'd memorized appear on his phone's display. His decision had crystallized at dawn after a sleepless night of weighing Emma's future against his own moral reservations. "Isabella, it's Daniel. I'll do it." The silence that followed stretched long enough for Daniel to wonder if the call had dropped, until he heard what sounded like a shaky exhale on the other end of the line. "Thank you," Isabella's voice was barely above a whisper. "I know this wasn't an easy decision, and I want you to know that I don't take your sacrifice lightly." "It's not a sacrifice if it benefits Emma more than it costs me," Daniel replied, though the words felt heavier than he'd intended. "When do we make this official?" "The legal arrangements are already in motion. We can sign the marriage certificate tomorrow morning at the courthouse, then begin the transition to our new living arrangement immediately afterward. The money will be transferred to your accounts within 24 hours of the ceremony." The speed with which Isabella had prepared for his acceptance spoke to both her efficiency and her desperate hope that he would agree. Daniel found himself wondering how many backup plans she'd developed, how many other potential partners she'd researched in case he'd refused her proposal. 3 weeks later, Daniel stood in the guest house of the Riverside Heights estate, surrounded by boxes containing everything meaningful from his and Emma's former life above the garage. The transition had been surreal. One day they were struggling to pay basic bills. The next they were living in accommodations that resembled something from a luxury magazine. Emma had adapted to the change with the resilience children displayed when adults provided consistent love, despite shifting circumstances. She'd explored every room of their new home with wide-eyed wonder, claiming the music room as her personal practice space, and marveling at the grand piano that was now available for her use whenever inspiration struck. "Dad, this place has better acoustics than the school auditorium," Emma announced, emerging from what they designated as her practice room with her violin case in hand. "When I play, it sounds like the music is floating instead of just making noise." The observation captured something Daniel had noticed about their new environment. Everything felt elevated, from the quality of light streaming through tall windows, to the way ordinary conversations seemed more significant when conducted in spaces designed for gracious living. It was as if Isabella's wealth had transformed not just their material circumstances, but the very atmosphere surrounding their daily lives. Isabella herself remained an enigma during those first weeks. She maintained her promise of separate living spaces, conducting her business from the main house while respecting the boundaries they'd established around family time and privacy. Yet Daniel found himself aware of her presence in ways that surprised him. The soft classical music that drifted from her office during late evening work sessions, the careful way she tended the gardens that surrounded both houses, the expensive car that disappeared for mysterious appointments that probably related to her medical condition. Their first public appearance as a married couple came at the Riverside Falls Community Foundation Gala, an annual fundraising event that brought together the town's remaining civic leaders and business owners. Daniel had attended in previous years as a small-time sponsor, contributing what he could afford to support local youth programs. Now he found himself seated at the head table as Isabella Sterling's husband, fielding congratulations and curious questions about their whirlwind romance. "You two certainly kept your courtship quiet," observed Judge Martinez, who'd been serving the community for 30 years and possessed the kind of institutional memory that made privacy nearly impossible. Most people didn't even know Isabella was back in town until the wedding announcement appeared in the paper. Daniel had rehearsed responses to such inquiries, but the reality of maintaining their fiction proved more challenging than he'd anticipated. "Sometimes the best relationships develop away from public attention," he replied, glancing at Isabella for support. "We reconnected through our shared concerns about Riverside Falls' future," Isabella added smoothly, her hand finding Daniel's with practiced ease. "It's amazing how common interests can rekindle old friendships." The physical contact sent an unexpected jolt through Daniel's system. They'd agreed that public appearances would require certain displays of affection, but the warmth of Isabella's fingers intertwined with his felt more genuine than performative. For a moment, he wondered if their carefully negotiated boundaries might prove more fluid than either of them had anticipated. The evening's highlight came when Isabella announced a significant donation to expand the town's music education programs, specifically mentioning Emma's involvement in the regional youth orchestra as inspiration for her philanthropy. The applause that followed felt genuine, marked by the kind of gratitude communities reserved for benefactors who remembered their origins. Later that night, as they drove home through Riverside Falls' quiet streets, Daniel found himself studying Isabella's profile in the dashboard lights. The successful businesswoman who'd commanded the room during dinner seemed smaller somehow, more vulnerable in the private space of their shared vehicle. "You didn't have to mention Emma specifically," Daniel said. "I know you were trying to make our story more believable, but putting her in the spotlight that way." "I mentioned Emma because her musical talent deserves recognition," Isabella replied. "And because I wanted people to understand that my investment in this community includes investment in its most promising young residents." The sincerity in her voice caught Daniel off guard. Over the past weeks, he'd been so focused on managing the practical aspects of their arrangement that he'd overlooked the possibility that Isabella's feelings about Emma might be developing beyond mere contractual obligation. "She's getting comfortable with you," Daniel observed. "Emma, I mean. She asks about your work, wants to know if you'll be home for dinner. I think she's starting to see you as part of the family rather than just the person who provides the house we live in. How do you feel about that?" Isabella's question carried weight that went beyond casual curiosity. Daniel considered his response carefully. Emma's growing attachment to Isabella represented both a beautiful development and a potential source of future heartbreak. His daughter was forming genuine bonds with someone whose time was limited by medical realities they hadn't yet fully discussed. "I feel grateful that she has another adult in her life who cares about her welfare, and terrified that she's going to love you too much to handle losing you when the time comes. Would it help if I pulled back emotionally, maintained more distance to protect her from future grief?" The offer was logical and considerate, exactly the kind of practical solution Daniel might have expected from someone who'd built a business empire through careful risk management. But the idea of Isabella deliberately limiting her relationship with Emma felt wrong in ways he couldn't entirely articulate. "No," Daniel said finally. "Emma deserves to experience genuine affection, even if it comes with the risk of eventual loss. Protecting her from attachment would protect her from pain, but it would also deprive her of love." They drove the rest of the way home in comfortable silence, both processing the implications of their evolving family dynamic. The guest house came into view with its windows glowing warmly against the October darkness, representing a stability Daniel had never imagined providing for his daughter. Inside, Emma had fallen asleep on the living room couch with a book across her chest and her violin nearby, evidence of an evening spent alternating between homework and practice. Isabella helped Daniel carry her to bed, moving with the careful gentleness of someone unaccustomed to handling sleeping children, but determined to learn. "She's remarkable," Isabella whispered as they tucked Emma under her covers. "Watching her play, seeing how completely she loses herself in the music, it's like witnessing pure creativity in action. Sarah always said Emma had something special. I just hope we're doing right by her, giving her the opportunities her talent deserves." "We are," Isabella said with quiet certainty. "The youth orchestra is just the beginning. I've been researching summer programs, advanced instruction opportunities, conservatory preparatory tracks. Emma's musical education will be limited only by her interests and abilities, not by financial constraints." The casual way Isabella discussed Emma's long-term development suggested a level of investment that went beyond their contractual obligations. Daniel found himself wondering whether his wife, the word still felt strange even in his thoughts, was simply being thorough in her planning, or whether genuine maternal feelings were developing. As they prepared to retire to their separate bedrooms, Isabella paused at the threshold between their living spaces. "Daniel, I want you to know that these past weeks have been easier than I expected, more comfortable. I was prepared for this arrangement to feel clinical or awkward, but instead it feels like we're building something that resembles a real family. Even though we know it's temporary?" "Especially because we know it's temporary," Isabella replied. "There's something liberating about caring for people without the pressure of forever. It allows us to focus on making each day meaningful, rather than worrying about whether we're building something that will last." The philosophy challenged Daniel's traditional understanding of family and commitment, but he couldn't deny its emotional logic. Since accepting Isabella's proposal, he'd felt more present in his daily interactions with Emma, more conscious of creating positive memories rather than simply managing the mechanics of survival. Good night, Isabella. Good night, Daniel. And thank you for today, for this evening, for making this feel real, even when we both know it's built on legal documents rather than romantic love. As Daniel lay in his new bedroom, surrounded by luxury he'd never imagined experiencing, he reflected on the unexpected directions his life had taken. 3 weeks ago, he'd been a struggling single father, facing impossible choices about his daughter's future. Now he was a married man living in an estate, with resources to provide Emma every opportunity her talent could utilize. But more than the material changes, Daniel found himself surprised by the emotional developments their arrangement had fostered. Isabella was proving to be more than just a benefactor or business partner. She was becoming someone he genuinely cared about, someone whose company he enjoyed, someone whose eventual loss would impact him far beyond the practical complications of her death. The realization was both comforting and terrifying. Their marriage contract had specified emotional distance to protect both parties from complications that might arise from genuine affection. But human hearts, Daniel was discovering, operated according to their own logic, creating connections that transcended legal boundaries and contractual obligations. As he drifted towards sleep in his comfortable new bed, Daniel wondered whether Isabella was experiencing similar, unexpected emotions, and whether their carefully negotiated arrangement was strong enough to handle the complications that genuine love might introduce. The discovery came on a Tuesday morning in late November, when Daniel entered Isabella's home office to deliver coffee and found her staring at a laptop screen with tears streaming down her face. She didn't notice his presence immediately, too absorbed in whatever she was viewing to register his footsteps on the hardwood floor. When she finally looked up, her expression shifted from vulnerable to carefully composed so quickly that Daniel wondered if he'd imagined her emotional state. "I brought your usual," Daniel said, setting the coffee mug on her desk while noting the way she quickly minimized whatever had been displayed on her screen. "You missed breakfast again. Emma was asking if you were feeling all right." "Just catching up on some business correspondence," Isabella replied, but her voice carried a tremor that had nothing to do with her medical condition. "Thank you for the coffee. Tell Emma I'll join you both for lunch if this conference call ends on schedule." Daniel lingered, sensing that Isabella's distress went deeper than business complications. Over the past month, he'd learned to read her moods through subtle signals, the way she held her shoulders when stressed about her health, the slight hesitation in her speech when discussing future plans, the careful neutrality she maintained when avoiding topics that made her uncomfortable. "Isabella, what's really going on? You've been working later hours, taking more private calls, and Emma noticed you barely touched dinner last night." "It's nothing that concerns our arrangement," Isabella said, her professional mask sliding back into place with practiced efficiency. "Just some corporate issues that require my attention." But Daniel had spent enough time around deception, his own and others, to recognize deflection when he heard it. Something was troubling Isabella beyond the medical challenges they'd already discussed, something she was deliberately hiding from him despite their growing closeness. The truth emerged that afternoon when Emma burst into the guest house with excitement that quickly transformed into confusion upon seeing Daniel's expression. "Dad, why do you look so weird? Did something happen at the garage?" Daniel had spent the morning researching Sterling Technologies online, following instincts that suggested Isabella's distress might be connected to business developments she hadn't shared. What he discovered made their entire arrangement feel suddenly precarious in ways that went far beyond her medical condition. "Sweetheart, I need to ask you something, and I want you to tell me the truth. Has Isabella said anything to you about her business lately? About problems she might be having at work?" Emma set down her violin case and studied her father with the serious expression she reserved for adult conversations that felt important beyond her understanding. "She's been getting lots of phone calls that make her upset," Emma said carefully. "And yesterday, when I went to ask her something, I heard her talking to someone about lawsuits and money and something called hostile takeover. She seemed really scared, Dad. Not sick scared like when she has her doctor appointments, but scared like when you used to get those letters from the bank." The comparison hit Daniel like a physical blow. Emma had witnessed enough financial stress to recognize the signs in others, and her observation suggested that Isabella was facing business problems that mirrored the desperate circumstances that had made her marriage proposal necessary for Daniel. That evening, after Emma had finished her practice session and settled into her homework routine, Daniel confronted Isabella in the main house's living room, where she sat with legal documents spread across the coffee table like evidence in a complex case. "I know about the takeover attempt," Daniel said without preamble. "I know about the lawsuits and the investors trying to force you out of the company you built." Isabella's hand stilled on the papers before her, and when she looked up, her expression carried defeat rather than surprise. "How long have you known?" "Since this morning, when I started researching why you've been crying over your laptop and taking mysterious conference calls at all hours." Daniel settled into the chair across from her, noting the exhaustion that seemed to have aged her years in recent weeks. "The question is why you didn't tell me yourself." "Because it doesn't change anything about our arrangement," Isabella said, though her voice lacked conviction. "The money I promised you is secured in accounts that can't be touched by corporate litigation. Emma's future is protected regardless of what happens to Sterling Technologies. But your future isn't protected, is it? If you lose control of your company, if these investors succeed in their takeover, you'll be facing terminal illness without the resources or corporate structure you've spent your life building." Isabella's composure finally cracked completely, revealing the fear she'd been managing alone for weeks. "They're using my medical condition against me," she whispered, "arguing that Huntington's disease makes me unfit to lead a technology company, that shareholders deserve leadership that isn't compromised by progressive neurological decline. They've hired medical experts to testify that my judgment is already impaired, that any business decisions I make should be considered legally questionable." The cruelty of the strategy stole Daniel's breath. Isabella was facing not just the loss of her life's work, but public humiliation, based on a medical condition she'd had no choice in developing. "What does your legal team say? Surely there are protections against this kind of discrimination." "There are, but they're complicated when you're talking about corporate governance and fiduciary responsibility to shareholders. The law protects employees from discrimination, but CEOs occupy a different category. If they can prove that my condition materially affects my ability to make sound business decisions, they can force my removal regardless of discrimination statutes." Daniel thought about the sharp, strategic mind that had built Sterling Technologies from nothing, the woman who'd negotiated their marriage contract with precision that protected both their interests. The idea that such intelligence could be dismissed because of a medical condition felt fundamentally unjust. "How long do you have before they can make their move?" "The board meeting is scheduled for next month. If they can secure enough votes, they can remove me as CEO and restructure the company's leadership. Everything I've built could be handed over to people who see it as nothing more than assets to be maximized, rather than a vision to be realized." "And you've been dealing with this alone because—" Isabella's laugh was bitter and self-deprecating. "Because I've spent my entire adult life handling crises independently. Because asking for help feels like admitting weakness. Because I was terrified that if you knew how precarious my situation really was, you might reconsider our arrangement." The admission revealed layers of vulnerability that Isabella had been hiding behind her composed exterior. She wasn't just a successful businesswoman facing medical challenges. She was someone terrified of losing everything she'd worked to achieve, while simultaneously fearing abandonment by the people she'd finally allowed herself to care about. "Isabella, our arrangement isn't contingent on your continued success or financial status. We made a commitment based on much deeper considerations than your net worth." "Did we?" Because looking back at my proposal, it's hard to separate the woman from the wealth she offered. Would you have agreed to marry someone facing terminal illness if she couldn't provide financial security for Emma's future? The question forced Daniel to confront the complexity of his own motivations. Had he fallen in love with Isabella the person, or had he been influenced by Isabella the benefactor? Were his growing feelings genuine, or were they complicated by gratitude for the opportunities she'd provided? "I don't know," Daniel admitted. "But I know that what I feel for you now has nothing to do with money or business success. I know that watching you face these challenges with courage and dignity has made me admire you more, not less. And I know that Emma loves you for who you are, not for what you can provide." Isabella's tears returned, but they seemed different this time. Relief rather than despair, hope rather than resignation. "The investigators who researched your background," she said quietly, "they also provided detailed reports about me, my business practices, my personal relationships, My reputation in the technology industry. Do you want to know what they concluded? Daniel nodded, sensing that whatever she was about to reveal would fundamentally change his understanding of their relationship. They concluded that despite my professional success, I was essentially friendless, that my relationships were transactional rather than emotional, that I'd built an empire while forgetting to build a life worth living. Isabella's voice strengthened as she continued. They recommended you not because you needed money, but because they believed you were capable of seeing past wealth to the person underneath. They thought you might be able to love someone despite their success rather than because of it. The revelation reframed everything Daniel thought he knew about how their relationship had developed. Isabella hadn't just been seeking companionship during terminal illness. She'd been seeking authentic connection with someone who might value her essential humanity over her external achievements. The takeover attempt, Daniel said slowly, is there anything we can do to fight it? Any way to preserve what you've built? We? Isabella's smile was tremulous but genuine. You said we, Daniel, as if this were our problem rather than just mine. Isn't it? We're married, Isabella. Whatever affects you affects our family. Emma adores you and she deserves to see the woman she's come to love fight for what matters to her. For the first time since Daniel had discovered her crisis, Isabella looked hopeful rather than resigned. There might be something, she said carefully, but it would require you to become much more involved in my business affairs than our original arrangement specified. It would mean public appearances, media interviews, demonstrating to shareholders and the business community that I have genuine family support rather than just professional relationships. What exactly are you asking? I'm asking if you'd be willing to help me prove that Isabella Sterling, the person, is worth preserving, along with Isabella Sterling, the CEO, that my life has value beyond my corporate productivity, that someone choosing to build a future with me suggests I'm worth more than the sum of my medical limitations. Daniel looked at the woman who'd transformed his life through an outrageous proposal, who'd given Emma opportunities beyond imagination, who'd become genuinely important to both of them despite the temporary nature of their arrangement. Yes, he said simply. Whatever you need, however we can help, the answer is yes. As they sat together in the elegant living room of the house that had become their home, Daniel realized that their marriage contract had evolved into something neither of them had anticipated. They were no longer just protecting each other from loneliness and financial insecurity. They were fighting for their family's right to exist on their own terms, regardless of external judgment about disability, mortality, or unconventional love. The confrontation Daniel had been dreading came 3 days before Isabella's crucial board meeting, delivered in the form of a manila envelope slipped under their door while they slept. Inside, photocopied documents detailed every aspect of their marriage with the kind of forensic precision that could only come from professional investigation. Bank records showing the $2 million transfer, medical reports confirming Isabella's Huntington's diagnosis. Even photographs of Daniel and Emma moving into the estate, time-stamped to prove the rapid timeline of their relationship. The message was clear. Someone was prepared to expose their arrangement as a calculated fraud designed to manipulate public sympathy. They're going to destroy us, Isabella said, her hands trembling as she reviewed the evidence that had been compiled against them. Not just the marriage contract, but the timing, the money transfer, even Emma's sudden enrollment in advanced music programs. It looks exactly like what it was. A business transaction disguised as a romantic relationship. Daniel felt a cold fury building in his chest as he processed the violation their family had endured. Someone had been watching them, documenting their private moments, reducing their complex relationship to a series of financial transactions and suspicious coincidences. Who sent this? The investors trying to take over Sterling Technologies. This is their insurance policy. If they can't prove I'm medically unfit to lead the company, they'll destroy my credibility by exposing me as someone who lies about her personal life for strategic advantage. Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway, drawn by the tension in their voices. She wore her school clothes but moved with the careful hesitation of someone sensing adult problems that might affect her world. Is everything okay? You both look like something terrible happened. Daniel and Isabella exchanged glances, both recognizing that their daughter deserved honesty about the threats facing their family. Emma had already experienced enough loss and instability to understand that security could disappear without warning. Some people are trying to cause problems for Isabella's business, Daniel explained carefully. They're making accusations about our family that aren't true but that could hurt people we care about. What kind of accusations? Emma's directness cut through their careful euphemisms. They're saying that our marriage isn't real, Isabella replied, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of the admission. That your father only married me for money, and that I only married him to make myself look better to other business people. Emma absorbed this information with the seriousness she brought to complex problems, her expression thoughtful rather than alarmed. But that's stupid, she said finally. Anyone who watches you two together can see that you care about each other. Like yesterday when Dad spent an hour helping you with your physical therapy exercises. Or when you stayed up late helping me prepare for my audition even though you had that important conference call. The observation struck Daniel with unexpected force. Emma was right. Somewhere between legal contracts and business arrangements, he and Isabella had developed genuine affection for each other. Their marriage might have begun as a transaction, but it had evolved into something that resembled authentic partnership. The problem is that people who want to hurt us will focus on how our relationship started rather than what it's become, Isabella explained. They'll use the money and the timeline to make it look like we're lying about our feelings. So we prove them wrong, Emma said, with the kind of straightforward logic that made complex problems seem simpler. We show everyone what our family actually looks like, instead of what these people claim it looks like. That afternoon, Daniel found himself in the unfamiliar territory of Isabella's corporate offices, surrounded by the kind of steel and glass architecture that proclaimed serious money and serious business. Isabella's legal team had assembled to discuss strategy for the upcoming board meeting, and Daniel's presence was both necessary and deeply uncomfortable. The personal attacks are designed to undermine Mrs. Sterling's credibility, explained Margaret Chen, the lead attorney who'd been managing Isabella's defense. If they can portray her as someone who manipulates personal relationships for business advantage, it supports their argument that her judgment is compromised beyond medical considerations. What's our counter-strategy? Daniel asked, feeling out of his depth in discussions that involved millions of dollars in corporate governance. We humanize Isabella's story, Margaret replied. We show that her marriage represents genuine personal growth rather than calculated manipulation. We demonstrate that her relationship with you and Emma has actually improved her decision-making by giving her emotional stability and family support. The approach made sense intellectually, but Daniel struggled with the idea of performing their private relationship for corporate benefit. Everything authentic about their growing connection would be reduced to talking points designed to influence board members and shareholders. There's something else, Isabella said quietly. Something I haven't told you about the timeline we're facing. Daniel felt his stomach drop, recognizing the tone that preceded difficult revelations. The hostile takeover isn't just about business control. If they succeed in removing me from Sterling Technologies, they can also challenge the personal arrangements I've made, including the financial provisions for Emma's education and your security. They're arguing that any major financial decisions I've made since my diagnosis should be reviewed for cognitive impairment. The implications hit Daniel like a physical blow. Not only was Isabella facing the loss of her life's work, but Emma's entire future could be threatened if vindictive investors decided to challenge every decision Isabella had made regarding their family. They can do that? They can take back money that's already been transferred? They can try, Margaret replied. Corporate law provides avenues for challenging financial decisions made by executives who may have been cognitively compromised. It's a long shot legally, but the threat alone could freeze assets for months or years while litigation proceeds. Daniel thought about Emma's youth orchestra participation, her advanced music lessons, the security that had transformed her from a worried child into a confident young artist. The possibility that vindictive strangers could destroy her opportunities felt like a personal declaration of war. What do we need to do? Isabella reached for his hand across the conference table, her touch warm despite the tremor that affected her fine motor control. We need to go public with our story, complete honesty about how our relationship started, why we made the choices we did, and what our family has become. No hiding behind legal technicalities or corporate spin. Just the truth about two people who found unexpected love while trying to solve practical problems. The prospect of media attention made Daniel's skin crawl. He'd spent his adult life avoiding notice, handling problems privately, protecting Emma from public scrutiny that might make her childhood more complicated than necessary. What does that look like practically? Television interviews, probably. A major network profile that lets us control the narrative before our opponents can frame it for us. Complete transparency about the money, the medical diagnosis, the marriage contract, everything that makes us vulnerable to attack. Margaret leaned forward, her expression serious. I need to be clear about the risks involved. Once you go public with this story, there's no taking it back. Your privacy will be permanently compromised, and Emma will inevitably be part of the narrative whether you want her to be or not. Daniel thought about his daughter, who'd already endured more instability and loss than most children faced. The idea of subjecting her to public scrutiny felt like another form of betrayal, another way that adult problems would complicate her young life. What does Emma think about this? We haven't asked her yet, Isabella replied. I wanted your decision first, because you're her father, and you understand better than anyone what media attention might cost her. That evening, the three of them sat in their living room while Daniel and Isabella explained the choice they faced. Emma listened with the focused attention she brought to important conversations, asking clarifying questions that demonstrated her growing maturity. So if we don't do the TV interviews, the mean people might take away our house and my music lessons and hurt Isabella's company, Emma summarized. That's a simplified version but essentially accurate, Isabella confirmed. And if we do the interviews, everyone will know our private business, but we can keep our family together and help Isabella keep her company. Again, simplified, but yes. Emma was quiet for several minutes, processing the implications of their situation with the kind of careful consideration that reminded Daniel of Sarah's thoughtful approach to difficult decisions. I think we should do the interviews, Emma said finally, because telling the truth about people you love isn't embarrassing, it's brave. The next morning, Daniel called the television producer Margaret had recommended and scheduled the most important interview of his life. In 72 hours, he would sit beside Isabella and explain to millions of viewers how a struggling mechanic and a dying billionaire had found genuine love through the most unlikely circumstances imaginable. Their marriage had begun with a contract designed to solve practical problems. Now they would discover whether the emotional connection they developed was strong enough to survive public scrutiny and corporate warfare. As Daniel held Isabella's trembling hand while they finalized their media strategy, he realized that their biggest challenge wasn't proving their love to skeptical strangers. It was admitting to themselves that what had started as mutual convenience had become something worth fighting for, regardless of the cost. The television studio felt like a sterile courtroom where Daniel and Isabella would be tried in the court of public opinion. Bright lights glared down on the interview set while cameras captured every nervous gesture, every hesitation that might be interpreted as deception. Daniel adjusted his tie for the third time, hyper-aware that millions of viewers would scrutinize his appearance for signs of the gold-digging opportunist his wife's enemies wanted to portray. Beside him, Isabella sat with the composed elegance that had served her well in countless business presentations, but Daniel noticed the slight tremor in her hands that betrayed her anxiety. They'd spent hours preparing for this interview, anticipating hostile questions and rehearsing responses that balanced honesty with dignity. Now, with minutes remaining before they went live, the weight of their family's future felt almost unbearable. "Remember," whispered their media consultant, "authenticity is your greatest asset. Don't try to present a perfect relationship. Let people see the real complexity of what you've built together." Emma waited in the green room with Mrs. Henderson, who'd insisted on accompanying them for moral support. Their daughter had wanted to participate in the interview, arguing that her perspective as Isabella's stepdaughter was crucial to their story. But Daniel and Isabella had agreed that protecting her from direct media scrutiny was more important than the strategic advantage her presence might provide. 30 seconds, called the floor director. Sarah Phillips, the veteran journalist conducting the interview, reviewed her notes one final time. Her reputation for thorough preparation and fair but probing questions had made her the ideal choice for their public revelation. If they could convince Sarah Phillips of their sincerity, they had a chance of reaching the broader audience whose opinion would influence Sterling Technologies' board members. Good evening, I'm Sarah Phillips, and tonight we're joined by Isabella Sterling, CEO of Sterling Technologies, and her husband Daniel Cooper for an exclusive interview about allegations surrounding their marriage and recent business challenges facing Mrs. Sterling's company. The red light above the center camera illuminated, and Daniel felt the familiar anxiety he'd experienced before every important moment in his life. Emma's birth, Sarah's diagnosis, the day he'd decided to accept Isabella's outrageous proposal. Ms. Sterling, you've built one of the most successful technology companies in the world, but you're now facing attempts to remove you from leadership. Can you explain what's happening? Isabella's response was measured and professional, outlining the hostile takeover attempt without revealing the personal vulnerability that had driven her to desperate measures. She spoke about corporate governance and shareholder responsibility, establishing her credibility as a business leader before addressing the more personal allegations. The investors seeking control of my company have made my medical condition a central issue in their campaign, Isabella continued. I was diagnosed with Huntington's disease 6 months ago, and they argue that this diagnosis makes me unfit for corporate leadership. How has this diagnosis affected your ability to run Sterling Technologies? Currently, the impact is minimal. I've implemented additional oversight structures and succession planning to ensure business continuity. My medical team confirms that my cognitive function remains unimpaired and my decision-making ability is unchanged. Sarah Phillips turned to Daniel, her expression neutral but penetrating. Mr. Cooper, you married Miss Sterling just 3 months after she received this diagnosis. Critics suggest the timing indicates a marriage of convenience rather than genuine affection. How do you respond to that? Daniel felt the weight of prepared talking points dissolving under the pressure of absolute honesty. The timing was absolutely about convenience, he said, watching Isabella's surprised expression from his peripheral vision. Isabella needed legal protection and family support while facing a terminal illness. I needed financial security to provide opportunities for my daughter that I couldn't afford on a mechanic's salary. Sarah Phillips leaned forward, sensing unexpected candor. So you're confirming that your marriage was initially a business arrangement? I'm confirming that our marriage began as a solution to practical problems for both of us, Daniel replied. But I'm also saying that the most important things in life often grow from unexpected beginnings. He turned slightly to face Isabella directly, speaking to her as much as to the millions of viewers watching their conversation. When Isabella first proposed this arrangement, I thought she was buying a husband for a year. What I discovered was that she was offering both of us the chance to build something genuine from circumstances that seemed purely transactional. Isabella's eyes brightened with tears that she didn't attempt to hide. Daniel is being more honest than our legal team advised, she said, her voice trembling slightly. Yes, our marriage began with a contract. Yes, money changed hands. Yes, we both entered this arrangement for practical reasons rather than romantic ones. But, Sarah Phillips prompted, but love doesn't always arrive according to our expectations, Isabella continued. Sometimes it develops between people who are trying to solve problems together. Sometimes it grows from mutual respect and shared commitment to something larger than individual needs. Daniel found himself speaking without conscious decision, the words flowing from emotions he'd been reluctant to acknowledge even privately. I loved my first wife deeply, and when she died, I thought that was the end of romantic love for me. I focused entirely on being Emma's father and running my business. When Isabella offered me $2 million to marry her, I saw it as a chance to provide my daughter with opportunities I could never afford. He paused, gathering courage for the admission that would either save or destroy their public credibility. What I didn't expect was to fall in love with someone who was brave enough to face terminal illness with dignity, generous enough to invest in other people's dreams, and strong enough to fight for what she believed in even when the odds seemed impossible. Sarah Phillips studied both of them carefully. Miss Sterling, do you share those feelings? I've spent my entire adult life believing that successful people don't get to have successful relationships, Isabella replied. That wealth and achievement create barriers to authentic connection. When I was diagnosed with Huntington's disease, I realized I was going to die alone despite everything I'd accomplished. Her voice strengthened as she continued. Daniel showed me that it's possible to be valued for who you are rather than what you can provide. Emma taught me that family doesn't require biological connection. It requires commitment to each other's welfare and happiness. And the money? How do you address critics who say that $2 million compromises the authenticity of your relationship? Daniel answered without hesitation. The money was essential to making our relationship possible, but it's not what makes our relationship meaningful. Isabella could have hired companionship or purchased loyalty, but she chose to invest in something that might become genuine rather than just functional. Speaking of investment, Sarah Phillips said, producing documents that made Daniel's stomach clench. "Our research shows that Ms. Sterling has made substantial financial commitments to your daughter's education and your community." Critics argue this represents manipulation rather than generosity. "Critics can argue whatever serves their purposes," Isabella replied, her professional composure returning. "But Emma's musical development and Riverside Falls' economic revitalization are investments in futures that extend far beyond my personal timeline. They're evidence of someone who believes that success should create opportunities for others, not just accumulate benefits for the successful." The interview continued for another 20 minutes, covering Isabella's business challenges, their family dynamics, and their plans for the future despite her medical prognosis. Throughout the conversation, Daniel found himself impressed by Isabella's courage in revealing vulnerabilities that most people would hide, and by her determination to frame their story as evidence of possibility rather than limitation. As the camera stopped rolling, Sarah Phillips approached them with an expression that seemed genuinely moved by what she'd witnessed. "In 30 years of journalism, I've interviewed countless couples about their relationships," she said quietly. "What you two have built together, regardless of how it started, represents something rare and valuable. I hope your honesty tonight helps people understand that authenticity comes in many forms." Walking back to the green room where Emma and Mrs. Henderson waited, Daniel felt simultaneously exhausted and exhilarated. They'd exposed themselves completely to public judgment, revealed every vulnerability that made them human, and trusted that honesty would prove more powerful than the strategic manipulation their opponents had employed. "How do you think we did?" Isabella asked, her hand finding his as they navigated the studio corridors. "I think we told the truth," Daniel replied. "Whether that's enough to save your company and protect our family, we'll find out tomorrow when the board meets." Emma looked up from her homework as they entered the green room, her expression bright with anticipation. "Did you tell everyone how much you love each other?" "We told everyone exactly what our family means to us," Isabella replied, kneeling to Emma's eye level. "Now we wait to see if the people who matter will listen to what we actually said rather than what our enemies want them to believe." As they drove home through the darkness toward the estate that had become their sanctuary, Daniel reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. A desperate proposal had become a genuine partnership. A business arrangement had evolved into authentic love. A family built from necessity had become worth fighting for, regardless of the cost. Tomorrow would determine whether their public honesty had been brave or foolish. But tonight, surrounded by the people who mattered most to him, Daniel Cooper felt like the wealthiest man in the world. The Sterling Technologies board meeting convened at 9 a.m. sharp in the company's gleaming conference room. But the real drama had been unfolding since dawn, through phone calls, text messages, and hastily arranged breakfast meetings between board members who'd watched the previous night's interview. Daniel sat in the reception area outside the boardroom, officially present as Isabella's spouse but practically feeling like a defendant awaiting a jury's verdict on his family's future. Isabella had been inside for 2 hours, presenting her case for remaining as CEO while her opponents systematically dismantled every argument she'd prepared. Through the thick glass walls, Daniel could see animated discussions, documents being passed around the table, and the kind of corporate theater that determined the fate of billions of dollars, based on PowerPoint presentations and quarterly projections. "Mr. Cooper?" A young assistant approached with the nervous energy of someone delivering important news. "Mrs. Sterling has requested that you join the board meeting. They'd like to ask you some questions directly." Daniel's stomach clenched as he followed the assistant into the boardroom, where 12 immaculately dressed executives turned to study him with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed hostility. Isabella sat at the head of the table, her posture composed but her eyes reflecting the strain of defending herself against accusations that reduced her life's work to symptoms of cognitive decline. "Mr. Cooper," said Harrison Walsh, the lead investor attempting the takeover, "thank you for joining us. We've been discussing your television interview last night, and several board members have questions about your relationship with Ms. Sterling." Walsh was exactly what Daniel had expected, silver-haired, expensively dressed, and radiating the kind of confidence that came from destroying other people's dreams for profit. His tone suggested that Daniel's presence was a formality before reaching predetermined conclusions. "I'm happy to answer any questions you have," Daniel replied, settling into the empty chair beside Isabella and noting how her hand trembled slightly as she reached for her water glass. "Let's discuss the timeline of your relationship," said Patricia Hoffman, another board member whose research Daniel recognized from the hostile investigation materials. You met Miss Sterling again in September, married her in October, and moved into her estate immediately afterward. That's quite a rapid progression for people who'd barely seen each other in 25 years. It is rapid, Daniel agreed. But sometimes, circumstances require quick decisions. Isabella was facing medical challenges that made traditional courtship seem less important than building practical support systems. Support systems? Walsh interjected. Or financial arrangements that benefited you significantly? Daniel felt anger rising in his chest but forced himself to maintain calm professionalism. Mr. Walsh, I assume you've done enough research to know that I was facing financial difficulties before marrying Isabella. Yes, our marriage solved practical problems for both of us. But if you think that makes our relationship less genuine, you understand very little about how real families actually function. Isabella shot him a warning glance, but Daniel was past the point of diplomatic restraint. These people were attacking his wife, threatening his daughter's future, and reducing their family to spreadsheet calculations. Real families, repeated board member David Chen, don't typically involve $2 million marriage contracts. How do you explain taking such a substantial sum from a woman you claim to love? The same way I'd explain accepting life insurance payouts or inheritances or any other financial arrangement between people who care about each other's welfare, Daniel replied. Isabella wanted to ensure that Emma's educational opportunities wouldn't be limited by my economic circumstances. I wanted to ensure that Isabella would have someone legally committed to advocating for her interests as her medical condition progressed. And if she recovers? If new treatments prove more effective than expected? Walsh's question carried the tone of someone setting a trap. Then I'll have the privilege of loving her for longer than we originally anticipated, Daniel said without hesitation. Mr. Walsh, you seem to believe that hope for Isabella's recovery somehow invalidates our relationship. I believe exactly the opposite. The possibility that she might live longer makes every day we have together more precious, not less meaningful. Margaret Chen, Isabella's attorney, leaned forward with documents that had been prepared for exactly this moment. The board should also consider the positive impact Mr. Cooper's presence has had on Ms. Sterling's decision-making and corporate performance. Since their marriage, Sterling Technologies has secured 3 major contracts, expanded into 2 new markets, and maintained industry-leading employee satisfaction ratings. Performance metrics that could be attributed to any number of factors, Walsh countered, including Ms. Sterling's awareness that her time in leadership was limited, creating urgency around decision-making that might not represent sustainable judgment. Isabella finally spoke, her voice carrying the steel that had built her empire despite the tremor that affected her hands. Harrison, you've spent this entire meeting discussing my marriage as if personal relationships were inherently incompatible with professional competence. You've analyzed my medical condition as if having Huntington's disease automatically disqualifies me from strategic thinking. You've questioned my husband's motivations as if loving someone with a terminal illness were evidence of mercenary behavior rather than exceptional character. She stood slowly, using the table for support but maintaining dignity that made every person in the room pay attention. What you haven't done is provide any evidence that Sterling Technologies has suffered under my leadership, or that my strategic decisions have been impaired by my diagnosis, or that the company's future would be better served by people who see it as nothing more than assets to be optimized rather than vision to be realized. The boardroom fell silent except for the hum of air conditioning and the distant sounds of a technology campus where thousands of employees worked on projects Isabella had initiated, problems she'd identified, solutions she'd envisioned years before her diagnosis. Board member Lisa Rodriguez, who'd remained quiet throughout the meeting, finally spoke with the authority of someone who'd been part of Sterling Technologies since its early days. I've worked with Isabella for 8 years, and I've watched this company grow from a promising startup to an industry leader under her guidance. The hostile takeover we're considering isn't based on evidence of declining performance or questionable judgment. It's based on fear of what might happen if we continue supporting someone whose personal circumstances don't fit conventional corporate models. She turned to face Walsh directly. Harrison, your presentation focuses entirely on Isabella's medical condition and marriage timeline. Where's your analysis of her continued strategic insights? Where's your evaluation of the products in development under her oversight? Where's your assessment of employee retention and corporate culture that she's maintained, despite facing personal challenges that would destroy most people? Walsh's expression hardened. Lisa, we're discussing fiduciary responsibility to shareholders, not emotional attachment to charismatic leadership. Miss Sterling's personal courage is admirable, but it doesn't qualify her to manage a multi-billion-dollar technology company while battling progressive neurological decline. And your emotional attachment to quarterly profit margins doesn't qualify you to dismantle everything Isabella has built just because you're uncomfortable with disability and unconventional love, Daniel said, his patience finally exhausted. The room erupted in shocked silence. Daniel had violated every protocol of corporate decorum, but he was past caring about boardroom etiquette when his family's future hung in the balance. "Mr. Cooper," Walsh began with icy formality. "No," Daniel interrupted. "You've spent 2 hours questioning my wife's competence and my character, reducing our relationship to financial transactions and strategic calculations. Let me ask you something. When was the last time any of you made a decision based on love rather than profit margins? When did you last risk your security to help someone else achieve their dreams?" He looked around the table, meeting each board member's eyes directly. "Isabella didn't just offer me money when she proposed marriage. She offered my daughter opportunities that would have been impossible otherwise. She invested in our community when more profitable options existed. She chose to face terminal illness with dignity rather than bitterness, and she's continuing to lead this company with vision that extends beyond her personal timeline." Isabella reached for his hand, her tremor noticeable but her grip strong. "If you want to remove her from leadership because you're afraid of how her medical condition might progress, that's your decision," Daniel continued. "But don't pretend it's based on her current performance or judgment. And don't insult our intelligence by suggesting that love makes people less capable rather than more motivated to excel." The vote, when it finally came, was closer than anyone had expected. 7 board members supporting Isabella's continued leadership, 5 favoring the hostile takeover. The margin was narrow enough to suggest ongoing challenges, but decisive enough to secure Isabella's position for the foreseeable future. As board members filed out of the conference room with expressions ranging from relief to frustration, Isabella remained seated beside Daniel, both of them processing the magnitude of what they'd accomplished and what it would cost them going forward. "Thank you," Isabella whispered, her voice barely audible above the background noise of a technology campus returning to normal operations. "For what?" "For being willing to fight for us, for seeing our family as worth defending even when it cost you privacy and dignity. For loving me enough to risk everything on the possibility that we might have a future together." Daniel brought her trembling hand to his lips, kissing fingers that had built an empire and were now fighting a disease that would eventually claim everything she'd worked to achieve. "Isabella," he said quietly, "what we have is already worth more than anything we could lose." Outside the conference room windows, spring afternoon light illuminated the Sterling Technologies campus, where thousands of employees continued working on projects that might change the world. Inside the boardroom, a mechanic and a billionaire held hands while contemplating a future that would be measured not in years but in moments, not in achievements but in the love they'd discovered through the most unlikely circumstances imaginable. 18 months after the board meeting that had saved Sterling Technologies, Daniel stood in the doorway of Isabella's bedroom, watching her struggle with a simple button on her pajama top. The progression of her Huntington's disease had accelerated beyond even the most pessimistic medical projections, transforming the confident businesswoman who'd once commanded boardrooms into someone who required assistance with tasks that had once been automatic. "Let me help," Daniel said gently, settling beside her on the bed they now shared, not from passion but from practicality, as Isabella's balance issues made sleeping alone increasingly dangerous. Isabella's hands trembled with frustration as much as medical symptoms. "I used to negotiate million-dollar contracts," she whispered, tears gathering in eyes that remained sharp despite her body's betrayal. "Now I can't manage pajama buttons without help." "Your mind is still brilliant," Daniel replied, carefully fastening the buttons while maintaining her dignity. "Yesterday you solved that software architecture problem that had your engineering team stumped for weeks. Today you're just having trouble with fine motor coordination. They're completely different things." The distinction mattered more than casual observers might understand. Isabella's cognitive abilities remained largely intact, making her physical decline feel like imprisonment within her own body. She could still analyze complex business problems, still demonstrated strategic thinking that impressed her colleagues, but she could no longer trust her hands to write signatures or her legs to carry her across rooms without assistance. Emma, now 13 and approaching high school, had adapted to Isabella's changing needs with the resilience that had characterized her entire approach to family upheaval. She'd learned to read the subtle signs that indicated Isabella was having a difficult day, automatically adjusting conversation topics and activity levels without making her stepmother feel like an invalid requiring management. "Dad," Emma called from downstairs. Isabella's physical therapist just arrived for her appointment. The twice-weekly therapy sessions had become routine, designed to maintain Isabella's mobility and independence for as long as medically possible. Daniel helped her navigate to their living room, where Maria Santos waited with the kind of professional cheerfulness that made difficult circumstances feel temporarily manageable. "Good morning, Isabella. How are you feeling today?" "Like my body belongs to someone else," Isabella replied with characteristic honesty. "But my mind is clear, and I slept well, so we're starting with advantages." The therapy session lasted an hour, focusing on balance exercises and coordination drills that looked deceptively simple but required enormous concentration for someone whose neurological system was gradually failing. Daniel watched from the kitchen while preparing lunch, marveling at Isabella's determination to maintain dignity despite circumstances that would have defeated most people. "She's remarkable," Maria said after Isabella had gone upstairs to rest. "Most patients at her stage of progression have given up trying to maintain their previous activity levels." Isabella approaches each session like she's preparing for a board meeting. "She approaches everything like that," Daniel replied. "Sometimes I think her stubbornness is the only thing standing between her and complete despair." That afternoon brought the weekly video conference with Sterling Technologies' executive team, a tradition Isabella had maintained despite her colleagues' growing discomfort with her visible symptoms. She positioned herself carefully at the desk in her home office, camera angled to minimize the tremor in her hands while she reviewed reports and strategic recommendations. "The quarterly projections look strong," said CFO Robert Mitchell, his voice carrying the careful tone people used when addressing someone whose condition they didn't understand. "The European expansion is proceeding ahead of schedule, and the new software platform is generating customer interest beyond our initial expectations." Isabella's response was sharp and insightful, demonstrating strategic thinking that remained unaffected by her physical challenges. But Daniel noticed how she gripped the desk edge to control tremors during moments of intense concentration, and how she positioned water glasses within easy reach to accommodate coordination difficulties. After the conference call ended, Isabella remained at her desk with documents spread before her, working on succession planning that would ensure Sterling Technologies' continued success when she could no longer provide active leadership. "How much longer?" she asked without looking up when Daniel entered her office with tea. "How much longer for what?" "Before I can't do this anymore. Before the tremors make video conferences impossible, before the coordination problems make strategic thinking too exhausting to sustain." Daniel set down the tea and settled in the chair across from her desk, studying the woman who'd maintained professional excellence while battling progressive neurological decline. "Dr. Martinez thinks you have 6 months to a year before symptoms become significantly more limiting. But Isabella, you've exceeded every medical prediction they've made. Your determination seems to slow the progression in ways that surprise everyone." "Determination doesn't cure Huntington's disease," Isabella said bitterly. "It just postpones the inevitable, while everyone pretends that positive attitude can overcome neurological deterioration." The rare moment of self-pity caught Daniel off guard. Isabella had maintained remarkable composure throughout her decline, focusing on maximizing her remaining capabilities rather than dwelling on losses. But the accumulated stress of fighting her own body while managing a complex corporation had finally reached a breaking point. "You're right," Daniel said quietly. "Determination won't cure your disease. But it has given you 18 months of meaningful leadership that nobody thought was possible. It's given Emma a stepmother who demonstrates courage every single day. It's given me a wife who proves that love can flourish even under impossible circumstances." Isabella's tears came silently, the kind of grief that accompanies acceptance of truths too large for words. Daniel moved around the desk to hold her, feeling the tremors that racked her body while she cried for the future they wouldn't have together, and the gradual loss of everything that had defined her adult identity. "I'm scared," she whispered against his shoulder. "Not of dying. I've made peace with that. but of becoming someone who needs total care, someone who can't contribute anything meaningful to the people she loves. Isabella, you've already contributed more to Emma's life and mine than we could ever repay. The woman you are now, the woman you'll be 6 months from now, the woman you might become if your condition progresses, we love all of those versions of you. That evening, the three of them sat in their living room after Emma had finished violin practice that now included pieces of extraordinary complexity. Her musical development had progressed beyond even Isabella's ambitious early projections, earning her acceptances to summer programs that would prepare her for conservatory auditions during her junior year of high school. "I got the letter today," Emma announced, producing an envelope that made both adults pay immediate attention. "From the International Young Artists Program. They want me for their summer intensive in Vienna." The program represented the pinnacle of musical education for teenagers, accepting only 12 violinists worldwide each year. Emma's invitation confirmed what they'd all suspected. Her talent had reached levels that could support a professional career if she chose to pursue it. "That's incredible, sweetheart," Daniel said, though his excitement was complicated by the timing. The Vienna program would take Emma away for 2 months, during a period when Isabella's condition might deteriorate significantly. "I don't have to go," Emma said quickly, reading the concern in both adults' expressions. "I mean, it's an amazing opportunity, but being here with you is more important than any summer program." Isabella's response was immediate and fierce. "Emma Cooper, you will absolutely attend that program. You will learn from the best musicians in the world, and you will come home with experiences that will shape your artistic development for the rest of your life." "But what if something happens while I'm gone? What if you get sicker and I'm not here to help?" The question hung in the air between them, highlighting the impossible choices that medical decline imposed on families who'd rather focus on hope than contingency planning. "Then you'll come home with memories of growing as an artist instead of memories of watching someone you love deteriorate," Isabella said gently. "Emma, my disease doesn't get to steal your opportunities. That's not how love works." As they discussed logistics for Emma's summer program, Daniel found himself marveling at the complexity of their situation. Isabella was simultaneously fighting to maintain her own dignity while ensuring that her declining health didn't limit Emma's artistic development. Their marriage had begun as a contract designed to solve practical problems, but it had evolved into something that transcended the boundaries they'd originally established. Later that night, after helping Isabella with her evening medication routine and ensuring Emma was settled with homework, Daniel stood in their bathroom watching his wife brush her teeth with the careful concentration that simple tasks now required. "I love you," he said suddenly, surprising himself with the declaration's timing and intensity. Isabella met his eyes in the mirror, toothbrush paused mid-motion. "I know," she replied after rinsing, "and I love you too, despite everything we both expected when this started." "Because of everything we never expected," Daniel corrected. "The woman I married for practical reasons turned out to be someone worth loving for completely impractical ones." As they prepared for bed in the elegant room that had become their sanctuary from medical appointments and corporate responsibilities, Daniel reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. Their time together was measured now in months rather than years, but the love they discovered felt larger than the constraints their circumstances imposed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: physical therapy sessions, business decisions, careful management of a condition that showed no mercy for hope or determination. But tonight, surrounded by the quiet sounds of their family settling into sleep, Daniel Cooper felt grateful for having learned that the most meaningful relationships often grew from the most unlikely beginnings. 2 years later, Daniel stood at the window of the Riverside Falls Memorial Hospital, watching autumn leaves drift across the parking lot while Isabella slept in the bed behind him. Her breathing had grown labored over the past week, requiring oxygen assistance that she'd resisted until the medical necessity became undeniable. At 36, she was dying with a grace that made everyone who knew her reconsider their understanding of courage and dignity. Emma sat beside the bed with her violin case, having driven home from her first semester at the prestigious Thornwood Conservatory the moment Daniel called. At 15, she'd grown into a young woman whose musical gifts had earned recognition far beyond anything they'd dared imagine, but whose maturity came from understanding that some losses couldn't be prevented through talent or determination. "She's been waiting for you," Daniel said quietly as Emma unpacked her violin. "Every time she wakes up, she asks if you've arrived yet." "I should have come home sooner. When you called last week, I should have— You should have done exactly what you did, Daniel interrupted gently. You finished your midterm performances because Isabella would have been furious if you'd compromised your academic standing to rush home before it was necessary. Emma nodded, understanding the complex logic of loving someone whose time was limited. Isabella had spent her final months creating frameworks that would allow their family to continue flourishing after her death, making decisions that prioritize long-term welfare over immediate comfort. The violin piece Emma began playing was one Isabella had particularly loved, a haunting melody by a contemporary composer that managed to express both sorrow and hope in equal measure. The music filled the hospital room with beauty that made the medical equipment and sterile surroundings fade into insignificance. Isabella's eyes opened gradually, focusing on Emma with the kind of recognition that had remained intact despite her body's systematic failure. You came home, Isabella whispered, her voice barely audible above the oxygen machine's steady rhythm. Of course I came home. Did you think I'd miss the chance to play for my favorite audience? Isabella's smile was weak but genuine. How was the conservatory? Are they treating my brilliant stepdaughter with appropriate respect? They're terrified of me, Emma replied with mock seriousness. Apparently, having a stepmother who's a legendary businesswoman creates certain expectations about performance standards. The gentle teasing reflected the relationship they'd developed over 4 years, part family, part mutual admiration society, entirely based on authentic affection that had surprised everyone who'd witnessed its development. Daniel, Isabella said, turning her attention to her husband with effort that revealed how much energy simple movements now required. Come sit with me. There are things we need to discuss while I'm still clear enough to make sense. Daniel settled in the chair he'd occupied almost continuously for the past week, taking Isabella's hand with the care required by her fragile condition. Her fingers, once capable of typing complex code and signing million-dollar contracts, now felt delicate as bird bones. The foundation paperwork is complete, Isabella said, referring to the comprehensive scholarship program they'd established to support young musicians from economically disadvantaged backgrounds. Emma will assume increasing responsibility for its administration as she gets older, but the day-to-day operations are handled by people who understand the vision. Isabella, you don't need to worry about business details now. I need to worry about the people I love having everything they need to build beautiful lives after I'm gone, Isabella corrected with the determination that had characterized her approach to dying just as it had characterized her approach to living. She turned to Emma, who'd set aside her violin to participate fully in their conversation. Sweetheart, I want you to understand something important about the opportunities you've been given, the conservatory education, the summer programs, the connections that will open doors throughout your musical career. None of that creates any obligations except to yourself and your art. What do you mean? I mean that some people might expect you to feel guilty about advantages that came from unusual circumstances, or to spend your life trying to repay what can't really be repaid. But the best way to honor what we've built together is to use your gifts fully, to create beauty that makes the world better, to remember that love multiplies when it's shared rather than hoarded. Emma nodded solemnly, understanding that Isabella was providing guidance for navigating the complex emotions that would follow her death. The house, Isabella continued, addressing Daniel, remains yours and Emma's for as long as you want it. But I've also established accounts that would allow you to live anywhere you choose, to follow Emma's career if it takes her to other cities, to travel, to make decisions based on what brings you joy rather than what you can afford. We've talked about this. I know the arrangements you've made. We've talked about the financial arrangements. We haven't talked about the emotional ones. Isabella's voice grew stronger as she addressed what might be their final serious conversation. Daniel, you're 43 years old. You've spent the past 4 years caring for someone who was dying from the day you married her. When I'm gone, I want you to be open to the possibility of loving someone who isn't dying. The suggestion hit Daniel harder than he'd expected. Since accepting Isabella's original proposal, he'd become so focused on their immediate circumstances that he'd barely considered what his life might look like after her death. I can't imagine loving anyone the way I love you. I hope you can't, Isabella replied with a slight smile. Every love should be unique, irreplaceable, specific to the people involved. But that doesn't mean your capacity for love dies with me. Dr. Martinez entered quietly, checking Isabella's vital signs with the efficient compassion she'd shown throughout their long relationship. The numbers she recorded told the story everyone in the room understood, but nobody wanted to acknowledge directly. "How much longer?" Isabella asked, demonstrating the directness that had made difficult conversations manageable throughout her illness. "Hours, possibly until tomorrow morning," Dr. Martinez replied honestly. "Your body is tired, Isabella. It's fought as long and as hard as anyone could expect." After Dr. Martinez left, the three of them settled into the quiet intimacy that had characterized their family throughout Isabella's decline. Emma played soft background music, while Daniel and Isabella talked about memories they'd created together, plans they'd made that would continue without her, and the unexpected joy they'd found in circumstances that had seemed impossible when they'd first met. "Do you remember," Isabella said as evening light began fading outside their window, "that first day in your garage when I made my outrageous proposal? You looked at me like I'd lost my mind." "I thought you had," Daniel admitted. "Rich people don't just buy husbands from struggling mechanics." "They do if they're desperate enough and lucky enough to find someone worth buying." Isabella's laugh was weak but genuine. "Though I have to say, you turned out to be a much better investment than my financial advisors projected." "How so?" "They calculated the cost-benefit analysis based on companionship and legal protection during medical decline. They couldn't quantify the value of being loved completely by someone who chose to stay despite knowing exactly what they were signing up for." As night settled over Riverside Falls, Isabella's breathing became more labored despite the oxygen support. Emma played violin softly while Daniel held his wife's hand, both of them maintaining vigil over someone who'd transformed their lives through the most unlikely proposal imaginable. "Hand. Thank you," Isabella whispered during one of her increasingly brief periods of consciousness. "For what?" "For saying yes to a crazy woman with an impossible offer. For showing Emma what it looks like to love someone without conditions. For proving that the best things in life can grow from the most unexpected beginnings." Isabella Sterling died peacefully at 3:17 a.m., surrounded by the family she'd chosen and the love she'd never expected to find. Her final words were barely audible, but Daniel heard them clearly. "Take care of each other." 6 months later, Daniel stood in the Riverside Falls Community Center, watching Emma perform as featured soloist with the Regional Youth Symphony. At 16, she'd grown into an artist whose technical precision was matched by emotional depth that made audiences forget they were listening to someone still in high school. The piece she'd chosen was the same contemporary composition she'd played for Isabella in the hospital. Haunting, beautiful, and somehow perfectly capturing the complexity of loss transformed into something approaching hope. After the performance, as applause filled the community center where their unusual family's story had unfolded, Daniel felt Isabella's presence in the music Emma created, in the opportunities that continued expanding before his daughter, in the love that had grown from the most unlikely circumstances imaginable. The marriage contract that had brought them together specified 1 year. They'd had 4 years and 3 months before Huntington's disease claimed Isabella's life. But the love they'd discovered, the family they'd built, and the legacy they'd created together would endure far beyond any timeline they'd originally negotiated. In her final letter, found after her death, Isabella had written, "Love doesn't require forever to be meaningful. Sometimes the most precious relationships are the ones that teach us how much beauty can be created when people choose to care for each other despite knowing that nothing lasts forever." Daniel Cooper, successful garage owner and devoted father, had learned that some offers were too extraordinary to refuse, even when accepting them meant signing up for heartbreak. He'd discovered that the most important question wasn't whether love would last, but whether it was profound enough to transform everyone it touched. As Emma took her final bow to thunderous applause, Daniel felt grateful beyond measure for the billionaire woman who'd walked into his failing auto shop with an outrageous proposal and forever changed his understanding of what family could become when built on courage, generosity, and the willingness to love without guarantees. The story that had begun with desperate circumstances and an impossible offer had become something larger than either of them had imagined. Proof that the most meaningful connections often grew from the most unlikely beginnings, and that love, once genuine, created legacies that transcended the limitations mortality imposed on even the most determined hearts. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.